All right, welcome everybody. We are pleased to bring you another free 90-minute webinar today from Desert Waters Correctional Outreach entitled From the Frontline to the Front Door, Preserving Wellness at Home Amid Corrections Fatigue. As we're recording today's presentation, please keep yourselves muted until the end when we open it up for questions. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions at that point. I'm Justin Stevens, Desert Waters Chief Operating Officer and Master Instructor. Desert Waters is a nonprofit established in Colorado 22 years ago, and our mission is to improve the well-being of corrections and other public safety professionals through training, consulting, and other essential resources to foster resilience, mental health, and overall wellness in these challenging professions. Please visit us at desertwaters.com to learn more about what we do. And if you like these free webinars, please take a minute out of your time and follow us and like us on Facebook or LinkedIn. And today's presenters are Stephanie Rawlings and Chris Stanley. Stephanie is a Desert Waters Deputy Director. Stephanie has 12 years in corrections experience with specific expertise in the area of developing, implementing, and overseeing staff wellness programming in large correctional organizations, including building and deploying a trauma response unit for staff. She previously served as a staff wellness program administrator for a large state correctional system and as director of workforce wellness for a large state child welfare agency. In addition to her involvement in Desert Waters, Stephanie serves as a consultant for correctional wellness and training. She holds a Master of Science degree in Criminal Justice Sciences from Illinois State University. And Stephanie's married to a wonderful, supportive husband and is the mother of 2 boys. And Chris Stanley is Desert Waters Director of Training. Chris has 20 years with the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation in California. During this time, he worked his way through the ranks of officer, sergeant, lieutenant, and retired as a captain. During his 20 years, he worked primarily in high security environments such as the security housing units, administrative segregation, and level 4 180 design facilities. Over the last 9 years of his career, he was actively involved in staff training, including holding positions as in-service training manager. During this time, he received certifications as a Master Use of Force instructor, Master T4T instructor, Master Milo instructor. I guess you could just say he's a master of all trades. He was certified as an instructor in various classes for annual training, and one of his most impactful certifications was CF2F and True Grit through Desert Waters. He also participated in departmental peer support program, helping and working with staff during critical incidents. Chris is married to an amazing wife and blessed to have 7 children, and although he may not look like it, he has 9 grandchildren. So with that, let me turn it over to Steph and Chris.
Hello, how's everyone doing today? Hopefully everyone's doing good. Want to take an opportunity to thank you guys for being here. Taking the time out to participate in this webinar. The reality is, in this environment, in today's topic and stuff like that, really, we're going to talk about the families and the impact that our families deal with and some of the stuff that we tend to miss out on, we forget about, and we kind of take for granted sometimes. When it comes to the job, we look for we expect our families just to kind of understand where we're at. And today we're going to talk a little bit about that and some of the areas where the pitfalls we deal with, we run into, and some of the areas where maybe we can work on improving those areas. Obviously, this topic we could spend hours on, and we do have some courses that are longer on this topic. But we're just going to kind of touch base on this and just kind of get you guys to hopefully just take a look at yourselves, your families, and the impact that's going on due to the job and what you guys go through. There again, preserving the wellness at home amid our corrections fatigue. So when we talk about corrections fatigue, we're talking about, the stressors and everything we go through. Corrections fatigue was a phrase coined by Katerina back in the early 2000s. And it just it's about our stresses and everything we go through and the effects the job has on us. So part of our families are impacted due to that as well. Now we can move on, Justin. So some of our objectives today is to describe ways work comes home in a counterproductive way, to describe what staff can do to lessen the impact of work coming home, and describing what staff can do to maintain healthy connections with loved ones. Because the reality is, when we ask you, if I was to ask you guys as a group, why you took the job, you know, um, almost everyone's going to say, because the money, the security and stuff like that. But probably 95% of you are going to include, you did it for your families. I know that was the reason I got into the department, was for my family, to take care of my family, to give them that security of benefits, of income and stuff like that. So my family was my driving force for starting the department. you know um but I wish that someone had kind of sat down with me back at the beginning and talked to me about some of the stuff we'll talk about today, because I might have been able to avoid some pitfalls that I dealt with, especially with my kids, and the impact it had on them. So we are glad to be here doing this today, and thankful again for you guys for being here. So we can move on, Justin. So talk about some of the negative lifestyle changes. You know, if I was to ask you guys, how have you changed, or have you changed since you came into the department? There's not one of you guys that can honestly look at us and say, I haven't changed at all. We've all changed. It's just part of naturally growing and stuff like that. We have changed, but in this environment, it changes us. And unfortunately, because we're dealing with a negative environment, it has the negative changes that really kind of stand out a lot. A lot of times there's some good stuff that stands out as well, but it seems like the negative stuff really kind of just comes to the surface a lot. So that's some of the stuff we want to kind of talk about a little bit here today. So next slide. All right. So family is not aware of how corrections may affect certain areas. Our families, they really don't have a clue. I mean, they're just excited that with us, they're just as excited as we are to have the job, to have the security, the income. A lot of times, they're excited because now, mom or dad is carrying a badge and they've got an important job, but they really don't understand how it's going to impact them. The reality of being available for practical needs and chores, at home. We travel across the country training, and the one thing that we hear that's universal, no matter where we're at, is staffing. Our officers are being forced to work 16, 24 hours at a time. Some of them are days on end, and so they're just not available at home to do those daily things. And so the reality is, because we're not there to be able to do those things, who ends up carrying that load? Those people that are at home, our spouses, our kids, and stuff like that. So it has that impact on them, and they don't realize that's coming. A lot of times the time together with our spouses, when you're used to a certain way and doing certain things and having those date nights and stuff like that, then all of a sudden you come into a job where you're working 24 hours, 16, 24 hours, and you don't have the energy or the time, or you miss it because you were forced to stay at work. It starts to have that impact, on spouses and couples. Our children's activities, how many games have you guys missed over the years, or events at school? It happens. And the reality is, our kids don't understand that. All they see is that mom and dad aren't there, and depending on how old they are, you might be able to talk to them and explain it. But the reality is, like I said, all they're seeing is that you're not able to be there, so there again, it starts to have that impact on them as well. Social events, for one, we're not able to be there. And for another, we start to build that anxiety and that uncomfort in social area environments, and we tend to withdraw. So we tend to pull back, and we tend to not want to do those things. But there again, when our families are going and we're not, or we're going and we're being a nightmare, you know, it has that negative impact. There's nothing worse than ruining the whole time. And sometimes as officers, I'll tell you, you need to listen to your spouse in those events, when you are there, when you're dealing with that anxiety, because sometimes they'll talk sense to you. I my my wife is amazing about that. She puts me in check all the time, when it comes to these things, because I'll get uncomfortable and sometimes she has to remind me, but there again, we tend to pull back. And if we're not open and we're not willing to listen, then, it has an effect on them. And then just that overall participation of that rhythm of life, because you're not there because you're working all the time, you're stuck doing these things. Life goes on, and they're moving on, and, you tend to get left behind, so it starts to create some issues that we'll talk about a little bit in a little while here. When it starts to create that separation, because they're living life and you're living work, and it just has that negative effect, so just some areas, like I said, where our families are going to get affected and they don't even realize it. And a lot of times we don't realize it. Like I said, we take the job, and I know I was guilty of this, where I expected them to understand that, hey, I'm working, I'm making the money, I'm taking care of them. You guys are supposed to understand that just automatically. The reality is they don't, you know, and there again, I wish that this kind of stuff had been talked about back when I started the department, because it'd been heads up, and maybe gave me a little bit of a opportunity to fix some things. But yeah, so just kind of that reality of how things affect our families. So some of the stuff there, again, some of the realities of the correction work and the effect on the family. The work's unfamiliar. It's difficult to relate to. There again, how do you explain to your families what you see on a daily basis? You know, um, I've seen some stuff that I couldn't even imagine going home and trying to explain to my family what I saw that day. You know, um, I've seen some strange objects put in some strange areas. And how do you explain that to average people? It's just not something that they can grasp a lot of times. It's tough for them to relate to. They're again hard for them to imagine those situations. They can't put themselves in that situation because they haven't necessarily been there. You know, um, the new terms, assumptions, and rules. How many of you guys have created in your family terminology that comes straight out of the prisons or the jails? You know, um, I know that lock up, cell searches, those all became like vocabulary in the house, especially with my kids. I'm gonna go do a cell search in your room. You know, the first time I said that to my older son, he kind of looked at me funny, like, "What in the world are you talking about?" Till I went in and started tearing his room apart, and then he figured it out real quick. But there again, so after that, anytime I said cell search, he knew exactly what I was, where I was heading. But there again, we create these new terms. You have we use phrases like kite. When you tell that to a kid, they're thinking you're going to go outside and go fly something. And reality is, for us, we're thinking of an inmate note. But just those different terms that come along, we change our rules. Because we see stuff that the normal person doesn't see. How many of you guys have tightened up on how you see things and how you deal with stuff since you came into the department? I know I did, after reading through some of the files and some of the stuff that I had to see, especially with my daughters. I mean, I got a lot stricter with how things went with them, and where they went in time frames and that stuff, because I saw some and read some of the just worst stuff in the world, about, child molesters and sex offenses and stuff like that, just really kind of changed my worldview on things. which ultimately started changing the rules in the house. But there again, we have those things that take effect. The danger, ever present reality. You know, you guys are going into a war zone every day, and that's the reality. You know, and so there's a stress there that goes along with that. And as your families, as you get further into the department and stuff like that, your families became more aware of those dangers just by hearsay or by some of the stuff you may share and stuff like that. So when you walk out that door, it affects them. They have that fear as well, because they're going to worry about you the whole time. you know um, I can remember one incident where we had a mass staff assault at one of the prisons I worked at. And it was a really bad one. And we went on complete lockdown, and we were outside, communication was shut off and everything for us for hours. And it was about 4 or 5 hours past my shift before I was finally released, and we got things under control. And by the time I got out to my car and my phone was going sideways because my family, the news had got a hold of it. And the helicopter's been flying over the institution, reporting it. And I had messages from my kids and my dad and several family members, because they were worried because they knew of the dangers that go on there. And so, it just added stress on them as well, not just us. Infectious diseases is always something that, we have an issue that we have to watch out for and we deal with and we worry about. I know, how many of you guys get your annual checkups? And in those annual checkups, how many of you guys are actually getting tested for the hepatitis and the AIDS and all those infectious diseases we deal with inside the prisons? Even now I'm retired, when I go in and do my annual checkup, I have them test for all that stuff, because I just, never know when if it's going to pop up or what could happen, or how long, the effects could be. But so infectious diseases can definitely be a huge factor for us, you know. Um, Relocation, there again, something that, has an effect on our families, and if we're not taking them into account when we're doing that, you know, we could be missing out on something and affecting them, because if you have kids that are established in schools and stuff like that, and then all of a sudden you yank them out, of their area and put them somewhere new, how does that affect them? Your spouses, their jobs, if you just arbitrarily say, take a promotion and then expect it, what kind of animosity does that affect? How does that affect them in that aspect of it? Um, there again, it's something we talk about a little bit more today, but, having those conversations ahead of time, but there again, like I said, it has those effects on our families. And then obviously government decisions, right? How many of you guys every election, we're stressing over who the elected officials are going to be because we know that that's going to change potentially our department. The rules change based on, the climate, the money changes, different politicians spend money differently, and view things differently, so those are always a huge factor. I remember in California, and Justin can remember this, where, we got furloughed, and that was a huge impact on us, and we watched guys across the board that just crumbled, financially, because those furloughs hurt them so bad that they couldn't do enough overtime to pay for all the toys that they had bought, but there again, like I said, government decisions and stuff like budgets and stuff like that, rehabilitation is huge across the nation right now. How's that affecting you? And how's that affect, if it's affecting you, how's it affecting your family? Because if you're taking it negatively, you're taking that stuff home with you and affecting them as well. All right. Next slide, Justin. So when we're dealing with all that, what ends up happening? We start building walls, and we call them walls of protection, and do we want to protect our families? Yeah, sure we do. You know, we want to protect them from this environment. We want to protect them from the negative stuff that we see. You know, so we have a tendency to not talk to them about it, not to share with them what's going on. You know, because we don't want them worrying about us. But there again, the reality is, even if we don't talk about it, you think they're not worrying about us? You know, I mean, just take a look at TV shows and the media and what goes on out there, especially towards law enforcement and corrections. You can't. I can't tell you of any show I've ever watched where it shows corrections in a positive light. You know, now don't get me wrong. There's some great shows, and I like a lot of those shows, but corrections is not in a good light. You know, so that's the stuff they see out there. So they tend, just that stuff right there alone can cause them to worry. You know, when we head off to work, when they see, that correctional officers are getting manipulated and getting, taken advantage of and beat up all the time on TV, and, the media's talking crap about it, so, there's always going to be that worry for them, so we want to try to protect them from it, but the reality is sometimes, we're not, you know, um, a lot of times we don't want to relive those events, if I was to ask you guys, how many of you guys have gone through a week and not witnessed a violent event at your facility? Now granted, some of you guys, depending on your the level that you're dealing with, you may get to enjoy a week or so with no violence. um I can't say that, and I don't know that Justin can either. We I can't tell you unless I was on vacation, and then I was able to say didn't see any violence. But you know, and a lot of times I didn't want to go home and talk about that stuff. I mean, let's be real. I just don't want to relive a lot of that. Watching someone bleed out, or stabbings, or that kind of stuff. It's just not something that you want to continue to relive a lot. You know, um, and you don't want to take up your free time. We say that we don't want to overload our personal life with our work life, and I think we try to do that as a whole, but what's the reality? you know Reality is that we're taking it home with us, and it is affecting our free time, even if we're not talking about it. The impact is having an effect on us, and then we don't want to look weak. I mean, when you're raising a family and stuff like that, last thing you want to feel is like you're weak. um and we have that uh mindset, and we have that culture that we work in where we have to be tough, and we don't want to show weakness. So that tends to transition into our family life and our personal life, to where we carry on that same thing. We want to maintain that strength, even when we're crumbling. We don't want anyone else to know that, and unfortunately that's where we lose a lot of our staff, is in that moment, because they're hiding behind those walls. They think they're protecting their family, they're protecting themselves, and the reality is they're crumbling, because they don't want to be seen, as weak. So that's one of those some areas that we got to really watch for, and but when we start talking about, well, the walls of protection, the reality is, when we're doing all these things, when we're trying to keep our families from knowing what's going on, we don't want to talk about it, we don't want to relive those things. Reality is, what we're creating is walls of separation, you know, and because we build those walls up to protect them, but the reality is we're building walls to separate, and we're creating these separations from them, and we're not letting them in, and then all of a sudden, next thing we know is, we're on an island by ourselves, you know, so we deal with those effects of it, and then we don't know how to break those walls down. Once those walls are up and we have that separation and we start dealing, we realize that the reality is we don't know how to break through them after we build them. We don't know how to get them back down. So that separation tends to widen and to spread. you know And next thing you know, you're sitting on Alcatraz, you know, with nothing but cold water and miles of ocean, you know, and there's not a whole lot you can do. So some of the potential outcomes because of that separation, you know, we separate from our families, we're separating, you know, creating those walls, and we built those things. But the reality is, that separation from our families, we have a tendency to see our coworkers as understanding us better, you know, as being, you know, more in tune with what we're going through, you know. But is that the reality? I mean, don't get me wrong, you know, your coworkers are, you know, like family in a lot of ways, you know, because you deal with those traumatic events, and you guys, you know, you have to have each other's backs. You have each other, you know, that old saying, "I've got your six," you know, and we always believe that, and it's true, you know, that our partners do have our backs. But the reality is, when you separate, or you have to if you're forced to leave work or whatever, get injured or something like that, who's there for you? You know, are your coworkers? And they are for a while. You know, they'll be watching for you. But the reality is, it's that old saying, out of sight, out of mind. You know, when we're not there on a daily basis, you know, there again, the job goes on, things go on, and they don't mean to, but they forget about you, or they just realize that, hey, it's been weeks since they've contacted you. You know, it's just that reality of it. But our families are still there, you know. But there again, we've created those walls of separation. So now we don't have our coworkers to lean on, or our families, you know, because we built those walls of separation. There again, like I said, continuing to drift apart from the families. And then the the old catchy one, you know, getting sexually or romantically involved with coworkers. You know, every agency tends to end with DC, right? Department of Corrections. You know, well, in California, it was CDC for years. It was California Divorce Court. You know, because that was just, you know, the how it seemed to go. You know, people get divorced all the time because of inner, you know, interwork relations. You know, and it's one of those things where it's a slippery slope, and you have to be cognizant of. But when you're separated from your family, and you've built those walls of separation, and you're looking for that connection with somebody, you know, who do you spend most of your day with? You know, coworkers. So some of the stuff, like I said, we deal with, and we have to watch out for, and we have to be cognizant of, you know, because ultimately, there again, we our families is why we got into this. Our families is why we're doing this, and our families is why, you know, when I get to the end of it, I want to be able to have my family around me to enjoy it, you know. And I'm blessed in retirement in that fact that I do. I have all my families around me. My kids are available. You know, I talk to them on a regular basis, but it wasn't always like that. You know, I did a lot of this. I had those separations. I created that. It wasn't until late in my career where I started to overcome a lot of this stuff, and had to rebuild a lot of relationships, you know. And fortunately, I've been blessed in that fact that, you know, I've been able to overcome some of this. But we want all of you guys to be able to recognize that, and to see that, and to continue to work on your families, and to break those walls down, and kill that separation. So some areas to address, you know, so your work home transition, you know, what do you guys do from work to home, or home to work? You know, do you guys have a system, or a method that you guys use to get that balance from work and home? You know, I've talked about a lot of this about this in a lot of trainings over the years, and you know, we hear all sorts of different things. Some people, you know, will listen to Five Finger Death Punch going to work to get ramped up, and Barry Manilow going home to mellow out. You know, um, people stop at parks to go for walks before they go home. You know, but they do those things in order to try to minimize the impact of the job on the home life, you know. So developing if you don't have one, develops a transition thing, you know, whatever it might be. Maybe it's taking a few extra minutes on the drive home, taking a long way home. So you get extra 10 minutes just to regroup, you know, or whatever it might look like for you. Some people said they sit in their driveway for 10 or 15 minutes. Some people have a system where they go home, get in the garage, take their uniform off, they go straight to the shower, and the family knows that, hey, I need, give me a half hour in the shower to myself, and after that, I'll be ready to go. Whatever that looks like for you, start looking at those areas and what you can do to help alleviate those stresses. And then going to work, you want to be able to let go of the home stresses to deal with the work stress, the work environment. So being able to have that transition both ways. Um, Prioritizing your sleep needs. There again, we talk to staff across the nation, like I said earlier, and they're working nonstop. 16, 24 hours. How do you think sleep's going? How's it going for you guys? You know, the reality is, like I said, it's sleep's an issue, and it's an issue across the board. And I know it's one of our driving forces, and we talk about it a lot in a lot of our trainings. To emphasize that stuff. So, when you prior to, obviously, quantity sleep's probably not an option for a lot of you. So making sure you get the quality sleep that you can get. Talking with your family. Letting them know, hey, I need this time frame to be able to get some sleep, having the kids stay quieter, whatever it might look like, having that discussion with your spouse, hey, we need this or I need that, or organizing that so you can maximize your sleep when you are at home to where you can still be functioning, not only for the job, but for your families. Because if you're shot out and spent, what good are you to your families? And maybe you're one of those people that work first watch, that 11 or midnight to 6 or 7 in the morning or whatever it might look like, that night shift, in order to be part of the family's daily activities. It works out great when you have kids in school where you work first watch, and then you can be home to do all school activities and stuff like that when you're not getting held over or stuck working. But are you getting your sleep need? Are you taking care of that? No, chances are you're not. You work all night and then you get home, you get the kids to help get the kids to school, and then they have an event that you want to go to. So you stay up and go to it. And then you end up getting 2 or 3 hours sleep at most late in the day, trying to, get ready to go back to work, but you just got to kind of start setting those things, and try to do stuff like, blackout curtains, sound machines, those things, white noise, try to avoid the TVs, as much as possible. And I can't tell you I was good at that. I'm bad about TV in bed, but, one of those things, like I said, try to avoid, emotional closeness, taking that time to make that connection with our families, have a social life, you know, try, it's great to have camaraderie at work, you know, but if you take that camaraderie and that social life at work and you take it to the outside, what ends up happening? You end up dragging work right along with you, because 9 times out of 10, when you get together with coworkers on the outside, what do you guys talk about? You talk about prison life. You talk about some of the events that you guys have seen or gone through or what's going on, you know? So try to create that social life outside of the prison environment, with people that aren't necessarily involved in the prison, building that social life out there with family and friends. Commitment to your coworkers and work. You got to have that balance. You got to be committed. You want to be committed, but we can be overcommitted. We can be too dedicated to the job and to our coworkers, and that can be dangerous, where, we're voluntarily working the overtime because, we want to be there for our coworkers. We want to be there. We're sacrificing our family time to be there for our coworkers and our jobs, and don't get me wrong. I mean, commitment to the job is great. We want committed people doing the job, but you have to have that balance with that. dealing with work overtime. There again, are you working overtime because you have to and being forced to, or are you just doing it because you want to, because you want all that money, you know? But what good's all that money if at the end there's no one to share it with, you know? So just something to kind of watch for there, you know. Areas, under investigation, there again, kind of prepping your family on what that might look like. You know, how does that work? You know, what's it entail? You know, you're not really giving them anything crazy. You don't have to give them all the information of the investigation, but just let them know, hey, there's going to be an investigation. This is what's going to kind of be the steps of it. You know, potentially I could be off of work. You know, so what are we going to do financially? You know, what can we do to kind of gear up and get prepared for that? You know, um, but and there again, you know, for me, I always told my family if I wasn't being investigated, I wasn't doing my job. You know, so that's just kind of that reality. Investigations are part of the job. You know, you should expect if you haven't been investigated, kudos to you, but you should expect to get investigated because, like I said, I mean, it's just every complaint inmate makes seems like you get put under investigation anymore. But just being ready for that. Our work related needs explained to our children. There again, just kind of breaking down to them, you know, why you need transition time, why you need the sleep time, and what that looks like for them. You know, obviously, I mean, depending on how old your kids are, you have to kind of gauge that conversation based on, you know, their maturity. But, you know, you can still, like I said, share with your kids, you know, what those needs are in their terms, you know, especially when it comes to like your sleep, you know, stuff like that. You know, there's a lot of conversations you can have there with them to help them better understand, you know, working holidays, you know, how big an issue is that, you know, for you? And, you know, how does that affect your kids? They're again explaining that to them and sharing with them, you know, and coming up with a game plan. We've had people, there was one in particular that shared about this where he was working Christmas. So him and his wife actually wrote a letter from Santa to the kids telling them about how important their dad was to the job and how much he needed to be there to protect the community, so the community could enjoy Christmas. But because of his dedication and his sacrifice, that Santa was going to come on Christmas Eve to their house and visit them. So they had their Christmas Eve, and then the kids got to have two Christmases, you know. But there again, just coming up with those ways to help your kids better understand the job and the what's needed there, and to try to work with to make it as less impactful on them as you can. Contingency plans if you're assaulted at work. There again, I know that this is something I never really did, never really thought about, you know. But if something happens to you at work, you know, who's going to take care of the kids? You know, who's going to contact your wife? You know, long-term care. You know, what's that look like? You know, so having those conversations with our families and our spouses on what needs to be done there potentially, or, you know, just to have some sort of a game plan or a sketch out of what it might look like. So to alleviate those stresses and those issues that could come up during that time. I mean, it's stressful enough to be assaulted, but when you have to add the stress of not knowing how to handle the family life, you know, can add to that. So just having that contingency plan can help you. And then dealing with those promotional opportunities like we were talking about earlier, you know, having that conversation beforehand, you know, hey, you know, the sergeant's exam, lieutenant's exam, whatever it looks like is coming up, you know, I'd like to take it, you know, however, potentially this could be an issue, you know, and having that discussion and determining whether or not that promotion's worth a relocation, you know, or, you know, hey, I'm going to take the test, but I'm only going to promote in this area to give them that security and whatnot. But just having those discussions with them, you know, and carrying on those conversations with our families can definitely help, you know, alleviate that stress at home. It creates that bond. The more we communicate with our families, the better that relationship's going to be, the emotional connection is going to be, and those walls of separation are less likely to come into play. And there again, we're not saying share all the gory details, you know, but you can share with them just stuff that, hey, it was a rough day sometimes, or hey, this is something that's going on, you know, and we need to discuss it, you know, and just surfacing just so they understand better of what you're dealing with so they can help you cope with those things. So that being said, I think we're on to Stephanie.
All righty. So we're gonna talk. We've talked a lot about navigating some family challenges, and now we're gonna kind of work our way into navigating some personal changes. So, coming from the perspective of how family members may be feeling about our work, over the course of goodness, I think Justin said 22, 23 years that Desert Waters has been in existence. As you can imagine, as we move through curriculum that we train in so many different departments, we hear a lot. We hear a lot of feedback from family members. We hear a lot of feedback from correctional professionals. We hear anything and everything that you can imagine. So, kind of as we move through this slide, I just want you guys to hear that this is real feedback that our team has heard repeatedly over the years, not one time, not two times, but many, many different times through different individuals, family members who have reached out to us, either individually or at Desert Waters. And some of the things that we hear from those family members is that when their loved ones started working in this career, they felt like their needs were swept aside. They felt like the job became an all-encompassing focus of their family member working there. And I think to some degree, especially at the beginning, that's normal. But when it becomes pervasive, and Chris talked a little bit about this in his slides too, is like when that overtime becomes a choice versus mandatory, or feeling like if you're emotionally spent at the end of the day and you don't have time to invest emotionally in the family, that could result in them feeling like their needs are not a priority. One of the things uh, that we hear a lot is that they are constantly trying to accommodate our needs, us being the corrections professional in that statement, where they feel like they are trying to keep the kids quiet or keep the house a certain level of cleanliness. I don't know about you, but corrections professionals tend to be some of the cleanest people. Um, and I don't know why that is, but my husband would frequently have that conversation with me as like, this house can never be to your standards. And that didn't start until I was in corrections. And one of the things that I finally was able to drill down on a couple years ago is that there were so many days where I could not see any movement of success or progress from point A to point B going into work, that I had to experience some sort of satisfaction of seeing a job done. And the way to do that was to clean like a psychopath when I got home. And so there was that constant like trying to keep the house clean enough that it doesn't send mom over the edge, and again, there's some humor to that, but it was a reality that we were facing as a family. Walking on eggshells, or being scared that we're going to trigger anger in a loved one is a piece of feedback that we hear a lot of times too. And I am sure that every single person, if you have worked long enough in corrections, your spouse, loved one, mother, father, son, brother, or dog has looked at you and said, I am not an inmate. Don't talk to me like that. This is not the housing unit. We are not out on the floor. I am not going to line up. I am not going, and that, we can laugh about that, but to some degree, it's true. And while we joke about it, there is certainly maybe that may be the surface level of how we're dealing with it, but the root may be much deeper and darker. And I'll never forget. I had an employee. We were laughing one day, and she goes, "I yelled at my 4-year-old last night to write a grievance." And we chuckled about it, and we had a good time. But at the same time, it was like, well, yeah, but that's like one of those indicators that, like, when you're telling the story the next day, that it's probably been going on a while. That tone or that facial expression has been there a while. We've heard about spouses specifically feeling like they have been widowed to the career. They don't know when their loved one is coming home. They don't know when they're going to get mandated. They don't know what holidays they're going to be able to get the time off for. They can't really make vacation plans. When they are home, they may be distant. So even when they're physically present, they're not emotionally available. And that can be very difficult from the family point of view. Feeling like you're now the mistress to the spouse that is the career. And that can be very abandoning, feeling like abandonment from their point of view. And they may even feel like they're single parents because, again, we talked about a lot of times we don't have control over that shift. We don't have control over staffing levels, retention. All of a sudden our population spiked, or this political decision or that political decision that leaves the our spouse or our partner or the other parent of our children feeling like they're alone in a very busy and stressful phase of life, which is child rearing. So, what can we do to counter negative personality changes? So, if you have taken our corrections fatigue to fulfillment course or been exposed to that material in any capacity, this will look familiar to you. We talk about the negative personality changes that accompany corrections fatigue, and we kind of, this is a pretty substantial part of that course, and we've dialed it down here to one slide in a couple of minutes. So I'm going to do my best in this condensed version. But a lot of times, what we're doing and where we're working is really, it can impact who we look at ourselves, and it can become our identity. Our identity becomes that work, that job, being that officer. And we may even convince ourselves that we're two different people. We're officer so and so, or we're correctional counselor or warden or whatever your role is for 8 hours. And then we come home and we're mom and wife or husband or dad or brother, sister, aunt, uncle, whatever you are outside of work. But the reality is you can't flip that switch just at the gate. And so a lot of times that those negative identity views and changes can come home with us. And that's where we can kind of start to see the strain that can be put on the family unit, is that when the reality is Officer Rawlings is going to come home. But it's just that Officer Rawlings can also take the steps to recognize that she can wear those different hats, and she can be both mom and corrections professional. It may impact our worldview. Chris talked about his daughters, and as they got older, and certainly his work in corrections impacting how he was parenting them and how he viewed different things. I hear from everybody, especially my background in child welfare was mentioned at the beginning, about the things that we know that go on out there. So we could develop a worldview that it's us versus them. Everybody around us is bad. Everybody around us is hiding something. My children aren't safe, playing outside with other kids. My children aren't safe with other adults. And while certainly bad things can happen, when it becomes so obsessive that it is restraining and impacting your relationships with others, that's what we're referring to here. And certainly spirituality, our capacity to love, our capacity to give, our capacity to invest into others, our capacity to see the good in life, our capacity to experience the wonders and the joy of being outside and in nature, those types of things that can really impact our spirituality. We work in, regardless of what your spiritual belief is, or if you have any, if you subscribe to a specific faith, I would just point out that spiritually speaking, prison is planet Earth's version of hell. Whatever hell is to you, that is where we are working. We are working in the place that is designed for the worst outcasts of society. And you certainly can't go in there day after day, decade after decade, and not be impacted by just the darkness associated with that place. Many of you probably work in jails or institutions where intentionally being able to see outside is blocked. And certainly that can impact your overall health and mental functioning after a while. And finally, our emotions and behaviors. We talked about this on the previous slide, is that when we lose control of emotions, that can be a negative change that comes with corrections fatigue. Our inability to self-regulate. Additionally, behaviors that we like to call it becoming more assertive, but is it assertive or aggressive? And how we interact with others. So I think the questions that we have to ask ourselves is, what can we do to help ourselves in these different capacities? How can we acknowledge that, yes, we work in this place that can certainly negatively impact us and our personality and create changes in us? What can we do to help ourselves? But also, we have to be asking the parallel question, what can we do to help our families and the people who love us? Because they are watching this, and I'll just be honest with you, if we're all gonna have a truth bomb today, they're gonna see it before we do. They're gonna see it a long time before we see it in ourselves. Um, I know that was the case for me. And I will tell you, even when I finally did see it in myself, and Katerina and Justin and Chris and I were joking about this right before we dialed in, the moment that I saw it in myself, I literally was angry at the person who made me aware. And that I mean, that was my reality. That was my moment of clarity. And I will tell you, by the time I got to that point, I'd already been working in corrections 7 years. And I was probably one of the luckier ones, because 7 years wasn't that long in comparison to a full career. So those two questions, I'd really like to draw your attention to those, and I'm not going to answer them for you today. I'm going to ask you to take the time to really self-reflect after we part ways, or you can stick around for the Q&A if you'd like to share an idea. But we're going to get into some tools as we move forward, but I really want you guys to think about today, what can we do to help ourselves, and how can we help them? And that may be different for every single person on this call. We're going to give you a couple ideas, but only you can truly answer that for yourself. So, topics to address. Everyone's favorite list. Moodiness. Um, I'm just going to tell you, there were more days that I came home angry than I came home feeling positive and satisfied with the work that I had chosen to spend my life doing when I was working in the institution. Moreover, I began taking things very personally. I was a correctional counselor for several years on a special housing unit with a caseload, and I realized pretty quickly that I would take it personally if I had been working with a particular inmate on reuniting with the children. Um, and they would do something to screw up, and they'd be in seg on Monday when I got back. I literally took that as a personal attack. And I think it was just kind of because it was an affront to the investment into the work that I had done. And I will tell you, that would drive that moodiness and dislike of people through the roof for me personally. And so I got to the point where it was just like, all right, people are stupid. And I remember that became my tagline. Somebody would say something and they'd be like, "Man, Stephanie, blah blah blah, this happened," and I would just look at them and I'd be like, "Well, people are stupid," and that's not helpful. Like, when somebody's trying to build a connection with you, especially like your spouse or your kids, are talking to you about their day at work and what they had going on at school, and your response is, "People are stupid." And I had to learn and build some tolerance, if you will, and maybe is the best word, that not everybody felt the way that I did about the world. And I would just say, corrections in general, that's probably a good reminder that most people out in the world probably don't generalize the way that we do. They haven't seen the things that we've seen. They haven't been exposed. They haven't walked those hallways or those galleries. And so, um, our newfound insensitive humor. Uh, I have heard it called many things: prison humor, dark humor, uh, humor to keep us sane. So I can laugh and joke and make the corrections humor with the best of them. I will say that since leaving the everyday 24-hour a day facility work, that has probably diminished a little bit, but I will never forget being at a Christmas party with my husband and another corrections employee. I happened to be there with her spouse, and we worked together. And we had one of those moments where we realized too late that everybody at the table did not think the joke that we just made and we're laughing hysterically at was funny. And it was an embarrassing moment and a level of awareness where um I looked down the table. It was one of those long tables, and I realized that she and I were cackling about something very crude. And which was also funny. We were at a railroad Christmas party, and I thought maybe we'd be safe there, and we took it too far. And it was a moment where I realized that not everybody else thinks that what we think is funny. And we use that humor as a protective coping mechanism. We laugh to keep from crying. Chris talked about it. He was like, when was the last time that you could say you didn't see violence at work? Like, that's not a normal experience. And if you can't find a coping mechanism, you're not going to last very long. And so we have to get to that magical word that everybody hates because it's so overused, finding balance. Balance in the humor that we need to go back into the fight day after day, but also balancing that humor in groups of people who don't understand why we have to use it. And so that really is the name of the game there, is finding that balance and dialing it down. Dialing it down when we're not at work, making sure that we're not making people uncomfortable, or worse, I don't think anybody here wants to go out in public and humiliate their family members. Your teenage kids, maybe that's fun, but I don't think we intentionally go out in public with the goal of humiliating our spouse and our family members and making them embarrassed to be in public with us, or making them feel like they have to explain why we are so demented. And I've seen that too. Um, Increased use of foul language. Again, it's difficult because that is, I call it it's the language of the facility. You go to another country, they may speak Spanish, French, or Greek. We speak prison, and prison looks like some foul language. And so while that may be normal, nobody bats an eye or turns a head. I've watched some coworkers get embarrassed a few times, and dropping those words in front of their kids, or getting that phone call from the school because your kindergartner is using those words in the class. And so again, these things, while humorous, they can drive a wedge of division within families. It might be humorous, once or twice, but I can almost guarantee that family members will get tired of having to explain, or get tired of being embarrassed, or get tired of not feeling like they can introduce you to a new friend because you're not going to like them immediately because you won't trust them. And so these are things just to be mindful, and maybe these are things that you can think about critically if this has been an issue in some of your relationships, or maybe you have coworkers that you're aware of or have talked to you about these issues. You can start to think critically about how they can be addressed. Discussing our health concerns with our adult family members. Why should we discuss our health concerns? Um, well, for the for this seems obvious, but sometimes I realize in corrections this comes with that wall of separation, wall of protection that Chris talked about earlier. If I told my husband every time I had an ache or a pain, he would be like, we need to go to the doctor and get that checked out. And I feel like sometimes it's like, no, this is normal. I'm aging, I'm 40 or whatever. However, I've also experienced some times in my life where I ignored health concerns until they flared up to the point they were out of control, and then we were in trouble. And he had no idea how long it had been going on for. And there was a level of frustration that I kept putting work first before my health. And I share that personal tidbit because I've seen it over and over, because that wall of protection that we build can end up working against us in very serious ways if we don't find ways to talk openly about the things that are going on with us, not only mentally but physically as well. And I know that all of us on here can probably name, without thinking too hard, 5 people that we knew died early who had worked in corrections for more than a decade. And I will tell you that at least one of them was a very, very good friend of mine. And it was early on in my career, and it was a very big wake up call for me, is that he had come to me and, one particular day at lunch, and he was just like, man, the doctor really read me the riot act during my annual exam this year. And he said, he told me that if I don't turn it around, like, I'm going to be in trouble. He was 46 years old. He died in his sleep about 6 weeks after that conversation of a massive heart attack. And I never forgot that. And it really comes back to, and I see what Chris dropped in the chat there too, is just that a lot of times we don't even realize it until a family member brings it to your attention. And I think he was probably referring to something earlier, but it works here too, is that your health can decline in corrections at that cumulative slow pace, that dimmer switch, that you may not even realize how far your health has declined before it's too late. So what can you do to start taking inventory of those challenges now? What steps can you take to start protecting and improving your health? Because as Chris said earlier, like, probably most of us got into this career for our families in some capacity, for the benefits, for the retirement, for the ability to provide for our families. And if we're not protecting and improving our health, then we're putting them at risk too. We're putting their future at risk. And so it would behoove all of us to take that inventory of our health. If you haven't been to a doctor recently, get yourself there. If you need to start looking at a different diet, if you need to start seeing a mental health therapist, because mental health and physical health are intrinsically linked. And and if one is not good, the other is certainly not going to be better. So, as we're talking about, the impact on family, it's important to point out that our physical health, if we don't have the energy for our family after we work all day, if we have zero energy when we get home, and no, I'm not talking about a double or a triple shift. I'm talking about just a regular shift. We come home and we don't have the energy to interact with our kids for 30 minutes or a half hour or an hour or whatever, or go out or do anything or do any kind of physical activity, then that's an issue. That's an issue. Taking a hard look at how we're functioning at home. So this is really more of an assessment that you can start doing on yourself, I guess, looking at your own relationships, looking at your own home life. Where are you investing your time and your energy on nurturing those key relationships? What does that look like? Are you making time? Do you have the energy to take that family vacation you've been talking about for 5 years? Do you have the time and the energy to spend uh, having a discussion with your spouse? Are you taking date nights? Are you investing in the kids? Do you know what's going on with the kids? Who are your kids' friends? Who are they hanging out with? What are their interests right now? What does that look like in investing time and energy into those relationships? Engaging in family activities. When was the last time you were able to do something as a family that was meaningful? Um, Do you have family movie nights? Do you go to the beach? Where do you live in the country? What is the activity that you invest your time in? Did you have family hobbies before you started in corrections, and are you still doing them now? Are those things that were meaningful to you before this career, are they still priorities for you now? Are you able to take care of responsibilities at home? Mowing the yard, changing the oil, home maintenance, chores around the house? Are you able to contribute to the home? Taking care of responsibilities in our community. Are you involved in community organizations? Do you volunteer? Was that something that was a priority for you before your career? Are you still able to make time for that? How do you engage in your neighborhood? And no, I don't mean just showing up to the HOA meeting to file a complaint. I'm just talking about how are you engaging in your community with uh, do you go to parades? Are are you aware of what's happening in your community and maybe your local government? Do you have an awareness of key issues that are happening in and around your town? And what can we do to improve these areas? Again, this is kind of a little self-assessment that you can begin that conversation of improving family health with. So again, we're going to refer back to a key part of the corrections fatigue to fulfillment course. If you've sat through that, again, you'll recognize this. We call it the honeycomb slide. I don't know if it's still in a honeycomb outline. I haven't looked recently, but at one point it looked like a honeycomb outline circle. And basically what we're looking at is we go through these professional phases of change when we begin our career in corrections. And I'm going to I'm going to come at you very quickly with a lot of information on this slide because really the meat and potatoes is going to be that our families are experiencing these professional phases of change right along with us. And there's some certain actions that we can help as the challenges for each of these uh, begin to emerge. So the honeymoon phase is just referring to when we start our career. Hopefully our families and ourselves are excited about the new job that we're starting, the new career path that we're taking, and they're excited for us. Maybe they're excited for the benefits, the steady income. Maybe they're excited that we graduated the academy, whatever that may be. And it's okay for us to be excited right along with them. And and then, kind of there at the beginning, we're beginning to be immersed in the work. We're learning the trade. We're learning everything there is to learn about a new job. And again, I'll point out that you may go through these phases of professional change every time you enter a new job, a new promotion, a new shift. Maybe when a new warden comes to a facility or new management takes over, you may go through this whole thing at many different times in your career. And this and your family will certainly go through it with you. And so that work immersion, they may still be excited, or they might start to feel a little bit left out. And they may feel left out because it may just be all about you and the job during this phase. And to some degree, that's okay. But this is where you have your first opportunity to start to bring them in. Tell them what you're doing. Tell them what you're learning. Uh, Maybe you can start introducing them to the lingo of prison because that will most certainly help you later to not have to tell a hour-long backstory just to tell a 5-minute thing that happened to you during the day. So if you start to build that foundation with them at the beginning, bring them along with you in that work immersion. There's most certainly going to be a negative aspect to this too. You are going to get your bubble burst. There's going to be one or more negative things that happen that make you pause and think, this isn't what I signed up for. This isn't what I thought it would be. This wasn't the thing that was going to make my world wonderful, and I was going to skip off into 30 years of career to retirement and live happily ever after. Whatever that bubble burst is, they are experiencing it with us. And I think it's important during the bubble bursting that you explain why the thing that is happening is negative, but also maybe you could be asking for their support. You could be telling them what you need because they may not know what you need at that time. Wall building, I'm not going to belabor wall building because Chris covered it beautifully early, but it's what we do to protect ourselves. We build walls at work, we build walls at home. And our families are certainly experiencing that wall building. At this point, if you've done the first four of these, either once or 10 times or 20 times. I've had employees tell me they do steps 1 through 4 of this like 4 times before lunch at their facility. And that always cracks me up. But it's also, there's probably a lot of truth to it. Um, Corrections fatigue can set in. And if you know, if you've been around Desert Waters long enough, or if you've attended any of these webinars or visited our website, you know that corrections fatigue is the term that Dr. Spinaris coined to address the cumulative negative attributes of working in corrections for a period of time, any period of time, really, depending on the rate that it's being experienced. And it's the negative decline in functioning, both physical and mental, that psychological, if you will, that can set in. And I think a lot of people immediately go to the word burnout, but this is really deeper than that. This is really deeper than burnout. I think burnout is what you can get in a lot of careers, but I think corrections is just different. It's a different monster. And certainly that fatigue can infiltrate the home life. Our family can experience that and feel it right along with us. And so I think, again, going back up to that work immersion, bringing them in, talking about it, evaluating where the home is. What are some steps that you can take to start protecting the home? And then finally, crossroads. Crossroads is when we come to that decision point, and our families are right along there with us. And it's important that we seek their input because typically at crossroads, you're making a decision. There was either a lesson to be learned here and there's post-traumatic growth to be had, and I want to stay in this work, or it's time for me to move on to a different career, or it's time to meet. And really, it doesn't always have to be a job choice. I mean, that was the example that I just provided, but crossroads could just be any particular decision point. And your family certainly is right along with you. Seek their input. Remember, they're on the outside looking in, but they're also living it with us. And they may see something that we don't see. So, certainly seeking their input and their guidance can be helpful as well. Finally, I think we all know that work can come home in unhealthy ways. Um, I don't think I have to say much more about that. We already know, we've talked about it. Potential family savers, though, becoming aware of these negative effects and devising ways to counter them. Again, Chris, Justin, and I have talked about this. Well, so many of us in corrections have talked about this. Man, if we'd had something like this, you know, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, the beginning of my career, the dozens of people who have said that to me, then things would be different. Well, today things still can be different. Nobody is so far gone that they can't start turning the dial back. You can make decisions starting to today. And awareness is like the biggest first step. Just acknowledging it, acknowledging that this impacts everybody attached to you, the work does, the things that come home, that's the biggest first step. And finally, communication, explaining what's going on and allowing them to help us. They don't have to know every gruesome, gross detail of what went on at work. You don't have to scare them. We don't have to terrify our families in order to let them help us. They want to help us. They want to support us. I believe truly that good, healthy relationships want to support us. But sometimes they're afraid to reach out and offer that first because, again, we may have created some situations that don't make us very approachable on that topic. So, allowing that communication to open up and allowing them to help us are key ways that we can start turning that dial back the other way. And now we would like to take the last 15 minutes. I'm going to toss it back to Justin because actually I think this is your part, but we're going to have a Q&A time, I think. I don't know.
Yeah. Yep. So First, I'd like to say thank you for attending today's Desert Waters free educational presentation. I hope you got something out of it. Um, Now go home, spend time with your family, and we'll catch you next time, July 24th, for the Shaking Before the Fall, Understanding Suicide Risk. Thank you, be safe, and have a great day.